Hello and welcome to the third part of the webinar series and this is the last part of the three-part series on demystifying the metaverse. We are extremely delighted to have a panel of experts to shed light on some of these topics. For the past few months, we've had different sessions that covered from the history, definitions, identity, and many other topics. And now we're talking about the society and commerce, fintech, education, and several other topics. The panel, I'm honored to have Raphael Brown and Sandy Agarwal to present their sections on these topics. After the session, we have a Q&A session with Dr. Sanjay Bapna of the National FinTech Center, and he's the chair of the Information Science and Systems Department at Morgan State University. I'm requesting that please submit your questions through the Q&A feature of Zoom and include your affiliation and your role in the organization, university, or company that you're with. We appreciate that you participating in this session, and we wish you a lot of success in this journey, learning about Metaverse. Without further ado, I introduce Raphael Brown to start the session.
All right, thank you. I'm going to just start a screen share. Let's see here. Okay. There we go. Good. All right. So I'm going to start in trying to use metaphors of interface and presence to describe the process towards the metaverse and how we go from self to social to community. We covered self previously as we dove into identity and avatars, and now we're making the transition to social and community. So for that, why do I care about this? I'm a game designer. I care about not just games, but interfaces, but also tracking and understanding computing power, understanding what I can build to, and how that will evolve. And particularly the transition from 2D to 3D, because 3D in many respects is my area, and XR is kind of the area that many of us in the game industry have been trying to shepherd forward for a very long time. So the transition that I want to describe and kind of frame for you guys is that the internet has had a process of going from 2D to 2.5D to 3D. From 2D displays, text, image, video, asynchronous multi-user to 2.5D as a transition point with pre-rendered 3D and still asynchronous multi-user to a transition of real-time rendered 3D and synchronous multi-user, which is frankly what we need for XR. And so 2.5D and 3D in some respects are both transition points along the way to XR and the metaverse and social computing. So what actually is that? First off, 2D. Very simple. 2D is the thing that we've had since the beginning of computing, since the days of mainframes, since the days of early computing, but it is still the core paradigm for mobile today. It is less of the component for desktop, but 2D images, text, icons, links, video, audio. This is, you know, a more passive interface and a more and a simpler interface is something that we started with because it was frankly all we could render. You know, you go back to the beginning and it was just text. You know, images were hard. And so why does this matter? Because we started to go into 2.5D where we had pre-rendered 3D and we needed to do that individually, and we couldn't hook up computers to bring them together until the very end of that, because computing takes time and it starts off slow and simple. You know, the best way, and you know, you can see this in some of the fighting games or in some of the shooter games, the best way that we could do 2.5D with little bits of synchronous is to have two people at an arcade machine, or conversely, to have, you know, if you look at something like Doom, to go, hey, it's run, you know, initially Doom was run on college networks. People played it close by in order to have the interaction as smooth as possible. That grew and it changed and it became more of a network play, but that took time. And so that went to 3D, and I'm glossing over, you know, literally 40 years of history. But the point is that 3D forced the notion of synchronous multi-user play. Yes, you can have one person go off alone on a computer and go into a world, but it's not really feeling like a metaverse because it's on one machine. Having multiple people together in 3D requires that you shift to a synchronous multi-user paradigm that traditionally has been primarily client-server. Some amount of peer-to-peer, but it's changed our notion of what the internet is to meld to what 3D needs. So why is this important? This is important because the metaverse as a notion is XR focused. The metaverse as a future facing notion, it's XR is real-time rendered 3D on lenses on your eyes and not on a 2D display. And XR is this container term for VR and AR and MR and eventually HR. And it is spatial computing. It's not, I use a mouse and a keyboard. XR is, I use motion of my hands and my head and my body to interface with the world and with data that's all around me. And it's a thing that we've been trying to do since 1956. And it's a thing that we just now have the capabilities to do as of about 6 years ago in terms of doing it smoothly and for the beginnings of consumers. So XR is the path to the metaverse, not 2D, 2.5D or 3D. But all of those are necessary to get us to XR, to get us to the metaverse. So really quickly, what is VR? VR goes back to things like the Sword of Damocles, which you've got on the bottom left, where it was so complex and hefty that it had to hang from the ceiling, that the components wrapped around a person's head. But you know, what you want is the image on the upper left, Ready Player One, the sense of here's this immersive world that you can put gloves and maybe a suit on and a headset and you're in the metaverse. And it takes time to get to that. We have had this history of going, if we want to have something in front of someone's eyes, if we want to render it on both eyes, like the middle image, that we have things like the VPL or like NASA's work, where they've been doing it for decades, trying to get the computing components small enough and fast enough and light enough and with low enough thermal to be able to get to XR, to get to the metaverse. So it's this long process, and a lot of it was frankly very lonely, which is why we're trying to get to social and community. It's that it was this cumbersome thing that you could only render on an individual, and you could not put them in with others because we didn't have the hardware and network capabilities of doing that. So by contrast with VR, because the metaverse should be this range of phenomena, what are some of the other bits? And actually, I'll go back to, a core definition. VR is a simulated experience that employs pose tracking and 3D displays to give the user an immersive feel of a virtual world. We have been building virtual worlds for more than 40 years now. We've been seamlessly rendering those worlds for about 30, 35 years, but we've been building them for a long time. And virtual world is not metaverse. Metaverse is a structure for bringing many worlds together. You're not making a metaverse if you make a virtual world. We've been doing virtual worlds for a damn long time, not just games, academia, enterprise. Everybody has been building virtual worlds. Metaverse is not a virtual world. Virtual worlds are virtual worlds. And the important thing here is that VR is a way to get immersed in a virtual world, whereas augmented reality is a way of focusing on interactive information in the real world. These distinctions are really important. This can all be part of a future metaverse, because part of it is to start with, VR blocks out the world. AR does not block out the world. AR takes your world as it is and overlays information, a wide variety of potential information, because AR says, bring the computing around your eyes as you are moving through the world, as you are geospatially connected to the world. So what is MR? MR is the mixture of the two. MR is the merger of the real world environment and the computer generated one, not just of information, but of the rendering and the connectivity and the interaction and the functionality of the two. MR is a thing that we actually still have a really hard time doing without a lot of custom components. And it's usually best demonstrated by experiments like some of the ones we see here that the military are doing, or by what is sometimes called VR-LBE, virtual reality location-based entertainment, where they have VR headsets, but they have people synchronously in together, and they overlap planes and geometry and characters and objects and levers, and there's a merger, there's a synchronous connection of the two, so that you can reach out and physically touch something and see in the virtual world that you're touching the same thing. That is MR. It is the seamless connection of AR and VR together, and it's really hard to do. But eventually we will take it for granted, because eventually we will have the tools and the technology to do it well, and it is the future of spatial computing. So there's one last one, which is HR. This was actually proposed by a philosopher, Jean, and I'm going to mangle this terribly, but Jean Baudrillard. The concept of hyperreality is the inability of consciousness to distinguish the real from the simulation. Here we see this illustrated by clips from, this is all a thing that we envision in movies. When we are thinking about the future, when we're thinking about Tron or The Matrix, the short film Hyperreality, or Free Guy, or any number of others, Ready Player One. The notion of this seamless, perfect merger that we don't have the ability to render now, that is more complex, it's kind of what we think of when we think of the metaverse. We think of this spatial connection, this perfect rendering, this potential for any number of worlds that we know we can probably get to in a few decades, but we don't know quite how we can get to now. That is hyperreality. It's an aspiration. And people use kind of XR as a future term or hyperreality kind of interchangeably, and they mostly mean the metaverse when they say it. This notion of it just is. It's all the things that we're trying to get to. So I'm going to try to step you through a map of how you get to social and community through the notion of presence. And this is going back to an academic article, an academic paper from 1992. So Carrie Heater put out a article in MIT Press, fall of '92, presence actually stepping back, being there, the subjective experience of presence. This particular paper has informed literally the last 36 years of VR, AR, MR, XR conception of what these are. It's not the only, there are others as well. There's the Milgram VRA, the virtual reality continuum, but this gave a structure for how we get to that, how this stuff grows. And the thing that I found when I dove into this paper back in the earlier days of commercial VR, back in 10 years ago, is that this actually gives a sense of how you can take it and apply it to the current internet in order to understand the metaverse. So I found that this particular paper was very prescient. And Carrie Heater, who I haven't seen her active in a while, I haven't tried to track her down, but she built out a structure that we're still using today. So not definitions of like the core definition of presence. This is a thing that we've had kicking around for decades, since the early part of VR, this sense of being there. So I put this reference for from the film, because this kind of surreal notion of being transported, being in another place, has always been necessary to presence. The notion of being able to be in a virtual location, to be transported, that has always been core to presence. And any notion of VR, AR, MR, XR, HR, or the metaverse is, can you be there virtually? So her notion is the 3 dimensions of presence. And keep in mind, like, this was initially set up for VR, but it's very prescient for other things: personal presence to social presence to environmental presence. This escalating outward notion of being able to understand a virtual world, a virtual space, a virtual society or platform greater than your own. So first, can you fool the eyes? Then going from the eyes, can you confirm the validity of a shared experience? And then if you can you go from that to a sense of environmental presence, where you confirm the integration, the obligation of a larger world? Can you have society, responsibility, commerce in a larger world that everyone agrees is there? Confirmation, agreement, understanding. These become necessary both for traversing a world visually or navigation, but also through payment, through understanding of obligation or ownership. So to dive through these quickly, personal presence is this sense of, at least in VR, it's the sense of fooling yourself. Can you transport yourself to be there? In VR, it's very hardware focused, because it's been a really hard thing for us to do, because VR as a field started in 1956, and we finally got to a commercial notion of it in 2016. It took us 50 years to get to a sense of presence where we could say we have just the beginning of fooling ourselves. But going from that to social presence, and this is important because it gets into social theory. Social presence is about having the beginnings of a connection to the world around you, and going from just can I fool myself to can we agree that we can be there together? Can we rely on communication and physics and shared observation, which, for VR is things like physics and motion, but in other areas, that same notion of social presence, can we confirm that we are there together? The thing that we are doing is only real if we agree that we are doing it together. Are we doing it at the same time? Do we agree on this world? Whatever shape this world is, in 2D or 3D or XR, do we agree on the parameters of the immediate world around us, the value that we have, the impact that we have on each other? Metaphorically, this can be carried very far. What I will just say is that social presence theory does not come from VR, does not come from games. It actually comes to an extent from science fiction, not surprisingly, Isaac Asimov, but it is something that has built off into sociology and psychology, but this notion of an understanding that there's a confirmation among people, that we confirm each other's communication and we confirm each other's interaction. The degree to which a person is perceived as a real person in mediated communication. And this is important because mediated communication doesn't mean 3D, it means any interaction between people. And so this notion of social presence, it carries in whatever medium, 2D or 3D or XR that we're going into. And social presence expression, while we can have notions of sports and play and information and creation and performance and communication that don't yet necessarily, they can have commerce, but they don't have to, but they have the interaction of people socially. These can happen in games, they can happen in VR, but they can happen in a living room, they can happen on the street. Social presence and the expression of it is universal. It is part of the underpinning of our society. And really what it just says is that when we go into an information space, when we go into a digital or a virtual space, we take those same notions of how we interact, and we just have a different lens that we take them through. So I will just say, going back to VR, VR, and this is specifically coming from a Stanford study where they're trying to prove the confirmation of social presence. They used physics to do so, that if two people, one in a physical environment and one in a virtual environment, confirmed each other, they did so through observation. Now, the important thing is that the easiest thing for them to test in the experiment was physics, but the point is observation of data that both people can confirm independently is the same. They understand it, they confirm to each other that the thing that they have observed, they can confirm and approve it is real, it is the same, they understand it, and it is predictable. That can be a whole host of interactions. The point is social presence requires confirmation. And there are many ways to do that depending on the interface that you're using. So environmental presence. Environmental presence started as this notion, particularly, in Carrie Heater's paper, of initially being, can you confirm that the greater environment, the world around you, confirms that you are real? But there was implication then of other notions that the society, the community, responsibility and commerce are real around you, that the environment is the world, and that the world is not just confirmation, but obligation, that it is pushing back and forth, and it is not just being there, or which is presence or being there together, it is staying there, it is coming back to there. It is persistence and consistence of experience, it is memory, it is change. It is a sense of going there repeatedly, going back to a world and understanding that it records your change and it in turn changes you. So these three dimensions of being there together, staying there, social, self-presence, social presence, and environmental presence, they then carry across a great many things if you use them metaphorically and if you use them as a structure, and they kind of give us a path to understand how to get to the metaverse. So the timeline for that, and I'll be handing this over to Sandy shortly, but from 2D to 3D to XR, what I want to get people to think of is that computing power, computing hardware moves across decades. And it moves in predictable patterns that we can start to see when you telescope out. So if we look at the 2D internet, that really started back with ARPANET back in 69. It started with that and other early transitionary networks, ARPANET, BitNet, and Usenet, and things that were really text-based. The 2D internet started with text, and then as we go into the first real phase of it, the self-presence phase of the 2D internet, you started to see images. And then you saw the beginning of the web because we could do text and images and smoother link transitions and the beginnings of audio. And then gradually even little bits of what weren't really yet video, but like animated GIFs and short sequences, and this sense of little bits of almost affected or pretend change. But the internet started as a 2D thing, and then it continued 2D, but you can map this notion from self-presence to social presence as we got into both the kind of the heydays of the web, and then also the beginnings of social media and initial payment systems and search systems as we got into the social presence phase of the last 20 years. And then overlapping that, we've gotten into environmental presence, going from social and community to society and commerce. And it doesn't mean that, that there hadn't, there were bits of payment and commerce on the internet going back, back to the 90s. And even in certain respects to before the internet existed. But the notion that everyone could do it, that people could get a job on the internet, that they could live effectively on the internet, that they could make a living on the internet, that's really about roughly the last 20 years. At the same time, there's been this explosion of mobile as the computing paradigm that has taken over, where the widest array of computers are now mobile computers. And in particular, there are people going online who have never used a traditional desktop or laptop computer in parts of the developing world, who are going online with mobile. And for them, the internet is experienced through mobile, through iOS and Android, and not through Windows or Mac or Linux or any of a variety of other computing paradigms around that. This is the 2D internet that we've had, and it's reaching a peak, and it probably has another few peaks, and the peaks are adoption. And we hit one in 2020, we'll hit another in about 2025, 2026, and then we'll hit another as the world goes online with the 2D internet. So the interesting thing then is when a lot of people are talking about the metaverse, what they're actually talking about is the transition to the 3D internet, which happens before the metaverse. Because the 3D internet is a variety of overlapping but staggered technologies that comes after the 2D internet. It's the rise of the CPU to the GPU, with folks like Texas Instruments and IBM and Fairchild and SGI and AMD and Intel and a whole host of others. But then it's the actual rise of the commercial GPU in 1996, which told us in that year, 4 years after Snow Crash, that we could render a metaverse, that we could go towards a metaverse because we could render it with the appropriate hardware, which we finally had, which was no longer just in industrial or commercial applications, but you could get an add-on card. A consumer could buy a GPU, and if everyone can have a GPU, they can get smaller, they can go everywhere, and then you can have a metaverse. And so the growth of the 3D internet with folks like NVIDIA and 3D Effects and ATI becoming AMD, and OpenGL and Microsoft with DirectX and Sony and Nintendo and Xbox and PlayStation, all of that, that came about because of the GPU. The metaverse requires the GPU. It requires rendering that is faster and faster in front of our eyes. So the 3D internet started there, and we got to this point. It took about 20 years for self-presence to basically go, there's still another 25 years of GPU growth, according to NVIDIA. And I very much agree with them. We've had 26 years so far. There's about another 25 to go. But it got to a point where GPUs were in just about every computing device, and they were fast enough to render 3D in every computing device. Hell, you can find them in refrigerators now. You can find them in cars. You can find them in calculators. You can find them in some microwaves. The GPU has sat alongside the CPU now, and it is allowing greater rendering. And that gets to where we're going with the 3D internet. And this is still, this is where Keter's paradigm fits and shows that there is growth, because in the 3D internet, we have the beginnings of social presence with things like Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite, NVIDIA's Omniverse, and a host of others. It's not just for games, but I'm laying out some of the big platforms that have millions of users. Horizons is trying to go into there. There's a great many others. But this notion was possible because we got to not just to a point of GPUs being everywhere, but 4G and broadband, and going towards 5G and cloud and edge that can render or assist the rendering such that you can present larger and more complex worlds and keep people in those worlds. And so environmental presence is something that we don't yet really have in the 3D internet. People are a very small number of maybe some of the esports folks, but you don't really have people making a living, which is the environmental presence notion, on the 3D internet. They are playing together, they are working, they are engaging, they are being productive and analyzing. there is social presence on the 3D aspects of the internet, but there is not yet environmental presence. The internet has another 20 years to go to prove out how 3D will grow. And that's important because the next thing is the metaverse. And that has a staggeringly long path because the preamble, the foundation, goes back, depending on when you want to count it, to either 1956 or 1959 with early VR prototypes. But the metaverse, the XR notion of spatial computing that you can engage everywhere, that is on your eyes, that is seamless and everyone can go into it, it's a thing that isn't really quite here, because I would say that a lot of this early stuff, the self-presence of going like, no, like we don't have the metaverse now, we just got to fooling our eyes, which was the first step. We've gotten to the beginnings of where we can have VR and AR and MR devices. In fact, technically we don't have MR devices that are consumer ready yet, and we barely have AR. We basically have VR devices that are consumer ready, and we still need about another 15 years of evolution from VR to AR to MR, where each of those is about 5 to 10 years staggered behind the next. So when we don't have the metaverse now, it is decades of good work ahead of us. But the important thing to understand is that if we use Heater's notion of the 3 dimensions of presence, we can go, we're in the internet has become 3D for more and more people. We're going towards this notion of social presence, which needs a lot of growth, and then environmental presence after that. The notion of 10 million people in a virtual city we can dream about, and we have no idea how to build it. We have guesses, but we need 1,000 times the rendering power, 1,000 times the network capabilities to do that. We have folks at Intel and NVIDIA and AMD and Sony and Microsoft who are envisioning this, and they know that they need at least 20 years to be able to grow to render this, because the metaverse is not a 3D internet, it is the thing after that. It is the thing when we can actually have XR devices and we can get to a notion that is hyper real. So that isn't to discourage anyone, but it's to say that the path forward is actually kind of predictable and it needs a lot of work. And the hardware folks have been on it for a long time. Yes, I'm actually on the last couple. So the thing I'm going to leave you with as I transition over to Sandy, and this is key in terms of understanding commerce as we're trying to get to more social and to more community, is that XR devices are still, like, this is why I say that the metaverse is far away. XR devices are 0.01% of the computing devices in use today. All of these things need to evolve. XR will be necessary for the metaverse. 3D is what we have now, but the device conundrum that I'm going to leave you with is that for right now, all of these things require device rendering, not web. They require the device on an OS and a firmware level, on a native level, knows how to run as fast as possible for 3D, and that is increasing for XR. And so the problem is, being frank, the web is relegated to 2D, and going forward with 3D and XR, we have these cloud platforms, hardware stores that run all of the payments, that promote safety and moderation, but have an iron grip on the curation, the moderation, the presentation of the experiences of the platforms, of the engines. And that is increasing and not decreasing. And so the device conundrum to leave you with is, how do we make it more open when the current notion of what the hardware needs is greater wedding to devices, to cloud to GPUs in order to render faster to actually get to the thing that you want when you say metaverse. And we're trying to figure out how to open it, and Sandy and I were talking about this just a couple of days ago, it is closing and not opening. It is tightening and not loosening. And there's a lot that we're all going to have to collectively do to engage the big tech companies, because you can't ignore them and they're not going away. And right now they hold the keys to the metaverse, and all of us will build it, but we cannot build it for them. We can build it with them, but not as serfs, as partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sandy.
All right, thank you, Phil. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here. That was an excellent overview, Phil. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So let me know if you guys can see my screen. Okay.
We can.
All right, and it's full screen, right? It's not chopped off and all that.
That's correct. It's full screen.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you. All right, so thank you, everybody. This is Sandy here. It's actually a tough act to follow in with what Rafal has presented, because he has presented such great information. This is really was really brief, but a very deep overview of where we've come from over the last many years and where we need to go in order to basically meet what we all collectively call as the metaverse. So with having said that, basically I'm going to start over here. So like Rafael said, basically the presentations we had earlier were more about individualism, more about how we identify a given person, what does it mean for a given person to be in the metaverse, and gradually from that definition of the metaverse and individualism, we go into what it means for societies and communities. So going to dive in here. So actually this dovetails exactly where Rafael left it. So, and I'm going to try to keep this a little quick today. So a quick recap on the components. So like Rafael very well explained here, that one of the key requirements for us to be in the metaverse is the devices. And what I've tried to enlist here is the key components. I'm going to just move this out a little bit. The key components of the metaverse. Like what are the things that the individuals need to explore the metaverse? So obviously the performing devices that the file very well spoke about, which are all the high GPU capability devices, high CPU devices. But just to have a quick rundown here, you need to have really highly performing devices capable of storing huge amounts of data, and also like I guess I missed to say that here, but with high computation powers. So whether that's edge devices like mobile devices, or strap-ons, whether you're wearing like one of the Oculus headsets, but ultimately it's all the different kind of devices which have high capabilities of rendering the data, and also at a lot of times processing data on the edge. And just to quickly basically go as to what the edge computing means here, is edge computing really means that you have huge amounts of data which is coming to you onto the device, and the device is actually processing the data and rendering information, whether that's through haptics, or whether that's through visual interface, or through audio, or a combination of everything. So, but then in order for any of that to work, you of course need to have computer networking with high speed, security, and availability. You have to have game engines and development tools, which will allow not only the development of these virtual worlds, but also a lot of user-generated content. That's what UGC stands for. So as some of the examples Rafael also referred to, whether it's Fortnite, whether that's Roblox, majority of these platforms actually are so successful because they allow huge amounts of UGC content, and people can come in and then they can make their own things, and they can experience the world based on what they're making, not just what was given to them. So, but again, a social presence at scale. So this is something I don't have to go any detail, but like we heard I'll speak a lot about that. That's obviously one of the core components here. But then another important thing is purpose. Now, I'm going to refer to this again in another slide here, but purpose actually becomes a pretty important thing because this is an ongoing conversation and a sort of a debate in a lot of ecosystems where some people say, well, you don't necessarily need to have a purpose to hang in the metaverse, you can just go there. But at the same time, you can be there, for example, you can go to a town square, you can go to a mall, but ultimately you're going to start getting bored by going there. You might actually hang around with your pals for some time. Eventually they will find something else to do. Eventually they'll have something more meaningful. And then once you lose that purpose, you may not even go back to that same space, whether that's a virtual world or that's the metaverse, what do we call that? So I think purpose becomes an important aspect of defining what you're doing over there. Now, not so much visible. I'm not going to go into too much details, but identity systems. So one critical aspect of the metaverse will be how do you authenticate and identify the people who are coming in there, whether that's like an AI generated graphic or whether that's somebody coming in with their avatar. But there has to be a pretty robust identity mechanism so people can go in and people can know who they're interfacing with, and the system can know, who that person is. So there's accountability and there's no chaos in general, basically. Hyperclouds essentially is the idea is that is the cloud systems we have today, like, whether you have AWS, Azure, Google and all that, but basically making cloud systems work in such a way that they can work with edge computing and with the local computing in a much better way and in a much more seamless way. Payment and commerce systems, and we're going to touch on this briefly later on. Governance mechanisms, which become super important because without governance, everything's going to start falling apart. And finally, standards. So just like I think some of the slides Rafael referred to, when internet grew all the way from all these 60s or 70s, or basically all the way into many decades, it grew because there were clear standards as to how do people exchange emails, how do people exchange graphics or HTML or TCP/IP. So similarly, there have to be standards in terms of how do people exchange, massive amounts of virtual data, for example, or I mean, if you think about it, the amount of data that we're going to end up having with the social presence is going to be, 100-fold or maybe multifold compared to the biggest images that we do today, because it's going to be all dynamically generated data, which is changing on the fly. And in order for any other system on the receiving end to be able to process that and not really be worrying about what format the data is coming in, that's going to become a critical aspect of the standards. Now, there's already, just to quickly mention that here, we're going to touch base on this for a second later on, but there is actually one of the biggest standard things coming out is the Metaverse standards community or the forum, and this being led by the Kronos Group and by W3C. I think IE is in there too, and I think it started with basically, I think like 35 some odd companies, but I think as of like within 2 or 3 months is already up to maybe 15 or 2,000 companies who are part of that standards group. All right, so gonna go in here. A quick recap of when we talk about identity. This, like I said, identity will be a huge aspect of the metaverse. So we talk about what is identity in the real world, and we have different views of identity, whether that's as to how do you identify yourself, or what do you think is your identity in the real world, or what a system thinks your identity is, to all the way from there to for example, if you present your passport, what is your identity based on your national records or based on your social records. Similarly, you have there has to be a concept, and it has to be pretty strong concept of identity in the metaverse, where generally speaking, when we think about identity today in the virtual world, is based on your avatar tag or your gamer tag. But even if you think about that, this is something which hasn't fully matured yet. And there's a lot of work being done in the identity realm. Like there's a lot of groups, including TOIP, Hyperledger, again, W3C, a whole bunch of other folks who are working on how do you really define it and create standards for identity in the virtual worlds, where one person can actually end up having multiple identities. How do you relate them back to an accountable identity in the real world? And doing so in such a way that you don't end up having the correlation issue where, for example, if you go into a virtual world, you might go into a virtual world where you're basically just participating in a Teams meeting. You might go there where you actually, for example, like say to Second Life, and you may not necessarily want your identity to be revealed to everybody else over there. But if it's going to be easy for anybody to see all your identities, back to a single real world identity, that's going to become an exposure of your privacy. So that's where the challenge lies as to how do you allow people to be pseudonymous, but not totally anonymous. Okay, I'm going to go down here. So now, again, I'm not going to have the time to go in the details of this here, but this is something I actually welcome you to check out. A really good podcast here at the journal. It's called How to Build a Metaverse. And what I've tried to basically pull here is actually I've tried to put together like a quick synopsis of the Second Life example. So Second Life pretty much started back in 2003, I think went live like 2007 something. And in fact, when Philip Rosedale started that, he actually started that with with Snow Crash as back of his head, where it's like, oh, okay, how can I actually make a virtual world with that thing in mind? So there's a bunch of things that actually worked for Second Life, and a lot of people flocked onto that, became pretty successful. But then this is where the purpose actually becomes pretty important, because eventually when people, the free to roam model was great, but then when the purpose became very, basically, unclear, people started to basically just move away, because they were like, okay, well, I can be there for some time, but I can really be there all the time. So this actually goes back to the concept that in order to have strong societies over there, it's got to be more than just a hangout place. It's got to be more than, and again, for example, even Second Life, and I think if I just quickly also go to the next thing here, the enterprise metaverse, Microsoft Mesh, Verbella by EXP, they're all coming up with the concept that you can actually have your enterprise metaverses, or basically enterprise metaverse. Now, this is actually in reality me today, this morning, on the Verbella platform, joining the Economist. There was supposed to be a forum in San Francisco. And as you can see here, I'm pretty lonely out here. And I think you can't really see here in the number of people, but I think the total number of people in the morning was maybe like 35 or something like that. So that kind of tells you that we are not quite there yet in terms of having, basically virtual rooms or presentations totally in the metaverse yet. I'm going to go down to the next part here. Again, quickly touching on the payment part here, just because I thought this was a very critical aspect, because for any society to be there, you need to have, like for any society to be working together, payments becomes an integral part of the society. And in fact, I'm going to just quickly check my chat here. Sorry, 1 second. So typical way we do the payments in the real world, I mean, as we know today, is basically you have your cash, check cards, you have ACH and wires, digital payments, crypto. Now, majority of things don't really work in the virtual world. So the like Rafael said, I mean, virtual world is not equivalent to metaverse, but like if we would basically say, well, the combination of multiple virtual worlds and your XR and MR collectively becomes the metaverse. How do you really have commerce and payments going on over there? So as of today, there's no, even though you can have marketplaces, even though you can have payments via platforms or other marketplaces, but direct avatar to avatar payments are generally not allowed. And that's where I actually pull the example of Telia, because Telia is one of the payment companies which supports payments, for example, for Second Life. And even in this scenario, they don't actually allow any direct payments between individuals over there. So it has to go through the payment platform, and they have to perform their own KYC. They cannot just allow anybody basically just to go ahead and make payments to anybody else. So I'm gonna go further down here. All right. So again, very quick synopsis of risks and opportunities. There are a bunch of opportunities here in terms of new ways to learn using, socialize, use AI and MR experiences, possibilities having work meetings like we saw here. Obviously, huge amount of opportunities for media and entertainment. If you guys haven't checked out the Lil Nas concert or the 21 Pilots concert by in Roblox by Rafael, please check that out. That's awesome. And of course, there's educational and vocational training, especially with a combination of AR. A lot of things that you can actually learn today by actually going to the vocational schools, you can actually learn that, virtually, basically by, for argument's sake, by learning how to fix an engine right in your own house by using AR. And there could be wholly new social platforms based on that. But that also leads to a huge amount of risk. And I have a link here to this paper, which I welcome you all to read. This is an excellent paper done by the researchers at UC Berkeley, and it talks about how using the biometrics and the data collected from, including the spatial data collected by the platforms. Anybody with adverse mindset or anybody looking to basically adversely affect anybody else can actually utilize the data to know a whole lot about a given person in terms of where they're coming from, which background they belong to, including with which gender they belong to, or what is their wealth level, so forth, based on how they're using the system, based on their surroundings and what kind of devices they're using, and so forth. So, of course, we have the governance and moderation of user behavior risk, cybersecurity concerns, and of course the standards, because standards are still going. So this is the one that I was talking about. So please do check this out, and I can share the link. So in summary, well, not there yet. So, basically just echoing the points made by the file. It's many more years to go. 10, 20, I think is anybody's guess at the moment. We're still in infancy. There's a lot of progress being made in multiple areas. It's a multidisciplinary area, and there's a lot of progress being made, but basically there's a lot of dots to be connected. And as we connect all these dots, eventually that's where we end up. That's where we end up into the metaverse. It's not just one thing or two things. It's multiple things working synergistically to get us to the metaverse. All right, so I think that should be the end of my presentation, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Sanjay so we can go with open questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Sandy and Raphael, for sharing your absolutely infinite knowledge and also wisdom in this metaverse world. Thanks to all the attendees for taking your time to come to listen to this series, the three-part series. We would also want to thank Ripple, our sponsor, and also our partner Hyperledger for making this series possible. Special thanks goes to Ms. Tanisha Brown for organizing this series of 3 webinars. So without her, this complete organization throughout, this would not have been possible. Thanks to Dr. Emdad and the FinTech team from the FinTech team. The recordings of this will be available after our annual conference in November. We have planned out more events. Please be on the lookout for emails about those subsequent events. Thank you all very much for coming to this series.
Thank you.
And thank you.